Sunrise. Biblical Teaching with Leslie Thomas.
And in this session, we are going to think about an historical fact with which Christianity is inextricably linked. Because the entire New Testament was written from the perspective of resurrection. The first disciples believed that Jesus, the Jesus whom they had known and walked with, was not conquered by death, but was still alive. And if their faith is not founded on fact, then the whole of the New Testament, the whole of Christianity, is based on a fallacy. Everything that Jesus taught, claimed, and lived out stands or falls on the truth of his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Ultimately, when we share our faith with others, we need to be sure that the resurrection is true. Books, great and small, have been written showing the factual nature of the resurrection. And I'd commend some of them to you, like Frank Morrison's Who Moved the Stone and Lee Strobel's The Case for Easter. But the way I want us to approach this topic today is to review a number of historical facts and the ways that they have been used to either attack or defend the resurrection. And along the way, we'll make excursions into some of the detail of the resurrection narrative. Now, it's widely acknowledged by serious historians that there are several solidly established historical facts that any historian must keep in mind when seeking to examine the resurrection. And these are some of those facts. Number one, the fact that a dying and rising Messiah was totally unexpected. Number two, the fact that Jesus was dead. Number three, the fact that Jesus was buried. Number four, the fact that a sealed tomb was found open. Number five, the fact that on the first Easter Sunday, the tomb was found empty. Number six, the fact of the undisturbed grave clothes. Number seven, the fact that the disciples were discouraged and disheartened. Number eight, the fact that the disciples had experiences of a risen Jesus which gave rise to the resurrection faith, the Easter faith. Number nine, the fact of the Christian movement arising in Jerusalem based on the belief that Jesus was alive. And for us, finally, number 10, the fact of the conversion of Paul. So let's start with the first of those, the fact that a dying and rising Messiah was totally unexpected. Now, amazing as it may seem, not one of the various profiles for the long-expected Messiah embraced in first century Israel by the different varieties of Judaism, and there were many different varieties, Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and others. None of these anticipated at all what Jesus did and said, and far less what actually happened to him. There were various ideas about who the Messiah would be and what he would do in circulation at the time that Jesus walked this earth. But they can more or less be reduced to three interrelated ideas. The first one was that the Messiah was going to win a final, decisive victory over the pagan Gentiles. The second one was that the Messiah was going to rebuild or to cleanse the temple. And thirdly, in some way or other, he was going to bring true God-given justice and peace to the whole world. But absolutely nobody expected that the Messiah would die at the hands of the pagans instead of defeating them, nor that he would symbolically attack the temple, warning of its imminent judgment, rather than rebuilding it or cleansing it. Neither did anybody expect that he would suffer unjust violence at the hands of the pagan Gentiles instead of bringing justice and peace to them. So we need to be clear that the crucifixion of Jesus would have been understood by any first century Jewish observer, whether sympathetic to his ministry or not. They would have understood his crucifixion to be a complete destruction of any messianic ambitions that he or his followers might have had. The violent execution of a prophet, and that's what most people thought Jesus was, let alone the execution of a would-be Messiah, did not give the Jew any belief whatsoever that he really was the Messiah, or that Yahweh's kingdom was revealed through his work. In fact, with irresistible certainty, it gave the opposite impression, that he wasn't the Messiah, and his work hadn't manifested God's kingdom. And we need to understand that the impact of this fact is as significant for his own disciples as it was for anyone else. The scriptures tell us that even the day before his arrest, they still held to typically Jewish messianic hopes. And they were utterly devastated by what actually happened. Now, we'll return to this later, but we need to understand this, that the fact of a dying and rising Messiah was completely unexpected. The second fact that we need to consider is the fact that Jesus was dead. And you might think that this is a rather odd fact to bring into our discussions, because as believers, we've lived long with the knowledge that Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried. But a recurring attack on the historicity of the resurrection is effectively, if there was no death, there can be no resurrection. So it's based on the idea that Jesus never really died. And a theory that's usually called the swoon theory was proposed by Karl Heinrich Venturini in the 18th century, claiming that Jesus didn't die, he merely fainted from exhaustion and loss of blood. But everybody at the scene thought that he'd died, and so he was buried. But in the cool of the tomb, he revived. And when the disciples saw him later, they thought that he'd risen from the dead. I mention this because a variant of this theory was popularized as recently as the 1960s by Hugh Schoenfield in his book, The Passover Plot. Schoenfield claimed that Jesus had felt himself to be called as a prophet to preach in Israel, but realized that his mission had failed. And so he went back to study the Old Testament again, and he became convinced that he should atone for the sins of his people. And so he hatched a deliberate plot to bring about his own crucifixion, but not his death. He provoked Judas to betray him to the council, who in turn handed him over to Pilate to stand trial for political sedition, claiming that Jesus' blasphemy in Mark 14:64 wasn't against God, but was against the divine Caesar. Schoenfield continued that Jesus' plot was so clever that he actually managed to arrange for his crucifixion to take place on a Friday, in the confident expectation that his body would not be left on the cross beyond sunset of that day, because then it led into the Sabbath, and they would want the bodies taken off the crosses by that point. And so Jesus, according to Schoenfield, had already prearranged with Joseph of Arimathea that at a given signal, which was, "I thirst," that a powerful drug would be administered to him on a sponge, sending him into a death-like trance. That done, Joseph immediately asked Pilate for Jesus' body, which was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb. Now, I have to say that Schoenfield goes off at even more crazy tangents than that as he develops his theory. But basically, the swoon theory undermines the resurrection on the grounds that Jesus didn't actually die. I would say to you that it's actually not very difficult to refute this theory at all. But to do so, we need to start with Jesus' crucifixion. And I'd suggest you look, maybe now, maybe at home, at Matthew chapter 27 as a guide to the events of the crucifixion. Because I want to point out some of the historic details that are encapsulated there. So let's begin, first of all, with an absolute point of historicity. The Bible says that Pilate oversaw Jesus' trial. But skeptical scholars for many years, wanting to attack the Christian faith, questioned whether Pilate had ever even existed, as the only evidence appeared to be written evidence and there was nothing in archaeology to confirm it. However, as has been the case so often in recent years, in June 1961, an archaeological team from Italy, led by a Dr. Frover, was excavating an ancient Roman amphitheatre near Caesarea on the Mediterranean, and uncovered an interesting limestone block. On the face is a monumental inscription, which is actually part of a much larger dedication to Tiberius Caesar, and which clearly says that it was from Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So all of a sudden, the skeptics are blown out of the water because archaeology hasn't just confirmed the existence historically of Pilate, but has also confirmed the precise political position that the Bible had claimed for him in the first place. So we can affirm that we have a true historical context here. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing about crucifixion, not Jesus' crucifixion, but just giving an indication about crucifixion in general, recorded an instance when a company of soldiers surrendered, but they only surrendered as soon as they were given a promise that they would not be crucified. Execute them in any other way, but not crucifixion, otherwise they would not surrender. That's how terrifying this form of execution was. And for the Jew, it was even worse, because it actually implied being hanged on a tree. And that, according to the scriptures, meant that they were under God's curse. I need to go into a little bit of detail here, and I apologize if this is a bit gruesome, but we do need to know just how hollow the swoon theory actually is. Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ, went some way towards depicting the harsh reality of crucifixion. But actually, although it was slated for being so violent, it doesn't go halfway towards the reality. We need to be clear just how barbaric, or more to the point, how unsurvivable crucifixion actually was. In accordance with what the scriptures say is Roman practice, or Roman practice is exactly the same as the scriptures describe. Before crucifying Jesus, the Romans would have flogged him as they would any other crucifixion victim. And their instrument of torture was called a flagrum, which was a large wooden handle that had leather strips attached to it. And set into the leather strips were either pieces of jagged bone or sharp rock. And Jesus was probably then secured to a whipping post. And a doctor by the name of C.T. Davis has researched medical aspects of what happened to a prisoner flogged with the flagrum. And he wrote these words: "The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across a person's shoulders, back, and legs. At first, the heavy thongs cut only the skin. But then as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and the veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead or rock or bone first produce large, deep bruises, which are subsequently broken open by further blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue." The Romans usually gave 39 lashes before a crucifixion. 39 because of a legal technicality. 40 lashes was so severe that it was considered that the victim who received 40 lashes was legally dead. And so after that, could not be punished further. Jesus received those 39 lashes. But after that savage flogging, he was forced to carry the crossbar of his cross. And arriving at the place of the skull, spikes or large nails were driven into his hands or wrists and into his feet. And once again, we find the skeptics having a field day, questioning a detail of Jesus' crucifixion in order to try to discredit the whole. There was a Professor J.W. Hewitt who wrote to scholarly journals some years ago, claiming that the whole crucifixion was a myth, simply because, he claimed, the Romans didn't use spikes or nails in crucifixion. They just tied the victim to a cross with ropes. So obviously, the New Testament was false. But this was influential. And even today, you will still see paintings of Jesus tied to a cross. Then archaeology once again came to the rescue. In 1968, an archaeologist whose name I barely can pronounce and probably will get it wrong anyway, whose name was Tseferis, excavated a family tomb in the northern part of Jerusalem that dated from the time of Christ. And in the tomb was a man by the name of Johanan ben Hagalgal. His whole family actually were buried in the tomb, but he had been crucified. And he had been spiked through his wrists, hands, and feet, and several nails or spikes were found in the tomb. So much for Professor Hewitt. He'd got his history completely wrong. Matthew also records for us that a spear was plunged into Jesus' side, which was actually a way of making sure that the person was properly dead. And when they did this, blood and water came out separated. And an article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, doctors examining the historical evidence of Jesus' crucifixion said that the spear had pierced the sac of fluid surrounding the heart. And if you want the technical details, it was published in 1986 in volume 255, edition 11 of the American Medical Association Journal. One thing we can say, even if Jesus hadn't been dead before that point, he most certainly was after. We can add into these facts that so much of the detail of Jesus' crucifixion dovetails precisely with the known historical context. The sign on the cross above his head, that wasn't a one-off, that wasn't unusual, that was the charge against the prisoner which was normally placed there. The soldiers tossed dice for his robe rather than destroy a valuable garment. Totally normal. They weren't stupid. They didn't want to go away with rags when they could go away with a garment. There were 4 executioners. That was also totally normal execution practice for a very good reason. Each one of those 4 had to sign the death warrant. And all 4 had to make sure that the prisoner was dead before they signed any warrant, because if they got it wrong, as Roman executioners, they got punished, quite possibly by death. So when they took Jesus down from the cross, those soldiers were not going to make a mistake. They knew that he was dead before they certified his death. There was a very skeptical, liberal New Testament scholar in Germany 2 centuries ago called David F. Strauss, and he was no friend of the resurrection, but he dismissed the swoon theory with these words: "It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, who still at last yielded to his sufferings, it's impossible that he could have given to the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he'd made upon them in life, and in death, at the most, could only have given it an elegiac or melancholy voice, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship. I believe that we can dismiss the swoon theory as utterly groundless. So let's move on. The third fact that we need to consider is that Jesus was buried. And again, we've got here an acknowledged fact of history that's been twisted in an attempt to discredit the resurrection. Harvard professor Kershaw Lake has written a book on the resurrection of Jesus Christ, suggesting that there were several tombs in the area where Jesus was buried, which was true, but that the women visiting the tomb early on the Sunday morning were not sure which of those was the correct tomb. And they came across one that was empty, and there they met a young man standing at the entrance. Guessing what they were doing, according to Kershaw Lake, he tried to tell them that they'd mistaken the tomb, saying, "No, he's not here." And he pointed to a nearby grave, saying, "See, there's the place where they laid him." But by this point, the women were scared out of their wits at being observed and worried that they might be reported to the authorities. So they fled. But of course, they misunderstood what the young man had been telling them. And they thought that he'd been saying that Jesus was risen from the dead. Well, that's the theory. But think about it. If that was what happened, then the disciples who went to check the women's story later must have also gone to the wrong tomb. But even if that's so, one thing's for sure, The Jewish authorities, when they asked for a Roman guard to be stationed at the tomb of Jesus to prevent his body from being stolen, they wouldn't have got it wrong. Nor would the Roman guards. After all, they had to make it secure and guard it. They weren't going to guard the wrong tomb. So if the resurrection claim was merely because the women and later the disciples had made a geographical mistake and gone to the wrong sepulchre, the Jewish authorities would have immediately produced the body from the right tomb, thus effectively quenching for all time any rumour of a resurrection. Okay, let's backtrack a little and deal with this properly. We read in the Gospels that when Jesus had been certified as dead, two prominent Jewish supporters recovered his body. Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple, he went to Pilate and asked if he could take away the body. Now, if you've ever been surprised about that, because I often have, why did Pilate agree? Surely the body was now the property of the Romans to dispose of as they wished. But he granted permission. And Joseph of Arimathea was joined by Nicodemus, who also provided about 45 kilos of myrrh and aloes. That's in John 19, verse 38. But what I want you to notice is that these two men were both Jewish rulers. They were both part of the 71, or the Sanhedrin. And as such, they were well known both to Jerusalem society and, because of their political position, to Pilate as well. That's why he agreed, because he knew that this was a man of authority and status. And the fact that they were prominent men actually confirms the truth of this account, because had it been a fabrication, it would have been refuted instantly. These men mattered. They were well known, and they certainly would not have permitted their names to be used in such a way if it were not true. Archaeological evidence confirms that the tomb described in the Gospels had to have been that of a rich man, which apparently in itself was a bit of a rarity at that point in Israel's history. And most certainly it wasn't a pauper's grave. It was only the rich who had rock-carved tombs, and especially those in garden areas. Add to that the fact that the information given in the Gospels correlates with the site of the garden gate at the north wall, where tombs have been excavated over many years. They're exactly like the one in which Jesus was laid, according to the Scriptures. There are several important aspects brought into focus here. Notice how it undermines ideas of misidentification when you realize that Joseph, Nicodemus, and the women all knew where this tomb was. So let's stay with that and consider our next fact, the fact that a sealed tomb was found open. Join me next time for the second part of this study in the factual nature of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Look out for my new book as well, which is entitled The Death and Resurrection of Jesus Christ, as recorded in the four Gospels, which takes all of this from a devotional point of view rather than from an apologetic point of view. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for listening to Sunrise with Leslie Thomas. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and leave a comment.